The year is 1985, in a quiet, almost deserted corner of Missouri, USA. By the side of the road stands a large green park called Route 66 State Park. At night, when the lights go out and a chill settles in the air, the place starts to feel faintly unsettling. A light chemical odor drifts from behind the trees. The soil seemed somehow off, and if someone told you that an entire city lies buried right under this grass, complete with homes, schools, and churches, you might think they were joking, but it's true. That vanished town was called Times Beach. At its height, over 2,000 people lived there. Then came a disaster so severe that the population dropped to zero almost overnight. Even after that, when a few residents refused to leave despite official orders, the government deliberately set fire to the whole town and removed it from maps across America and beyond. But why? What could have happened to make the United States erase a once thriving community from its history and its geography, right down to burning it to the ground? That's the question we'll answer in this episode. Now, picture this. It's 1986 in Pripyat, Ukraine. Rows of concrete apartment blocks, a playground in the foreground, a Ferris wheel standing idle at the back. This purpose-built city was created for around 500 workers at the Chernobyl nuclear plant and their families. Then, on the night of the 26th of April, reactor number 4 exploded. A brilliant blue-white flash, a massive blast, and an invisible poison that spread devastation across the city and much of Europe. Within hours, a bustling city of hundreds of thousands became a ghost town. Today its population remains zero, but Chernobyl wasn't the first disaster of its kind. An even more shocking event had already taken place in the United States, one that most people have never heard of. The story actually begins back in 1925. A St. Louis newspaper, the St. Louis Star-Times, ran an unusual promotion. Take out a 6-month subscription and they'd give you a small plot of land along the Merrimack River. Newspaper plus free land, a strange but tempting package. The land had belonged to a farmer. The paper bought it at a low price, subdivided it into plots, and called the development Times Beach. It sat roughly 17 miles from the city, right on the river. Initially, it wasn't intended for year-round living. It was a summer retreat. Families from St. Louis would come down for the weekend, fish in the river, go boating and enjoy the fresh air, a pleasant escape from the city. Then the Great Depression struck in 1929. Jobs disappeared. Rents became unaffordable. Many families moved onto this inexpensive land. Gradually, Times Beach evolved into a proper small town. Summer cabins were replaced with solid houses. Because of the river's flood risk, many homes were raised on stilts, leaving open space underneath so floodwater could pass through without entering the living areas. In time, the town gained 4 churches, a couple of small bars, a shop selling liquor and fishing gear, a town hall, and even a convenience store similar to a 7-Eleven. The residents weren't well off, but the community felt close-knit, almost like an extended family. Yet the town had 2 persistent problems: flooding and dust. The Merrimack River flooded regularly. Small floods were so common that people accepted them as part of life. The elevated houses usually kept the worst at bay, and residents would simply clean up afterwards. The dust was worse. With so little money, almost none of the roads were paved, more than 20 miles of dirt tracks. In summer, every passing vehicle sent up thick clouds of dust that drifted into homes, coating plates, bedding, and clothes. Children came in from play, looking like they'd been rolled in earth. The dust was relentless, but the town couldn't afford to pave the streets. They needed an inexpensive solution, and that's where this story takes its darkest turn. Far to the southwest in Missouri lay the small town of Verona. Between the 1960s and 1970s, a chemical plant operated there. It began as Hoffman Taff, which produced Agent Orange during the Vietnam War era. Later, it became Northeastern Pharmaceutical and Chemical Company, known as NEPAC-CO. The company started manufacturing hexachlorophene, an antibacterial agent used in soaps, toothpastes, and creams. The trouble was that the production process generated a highly toxic waste, dioxin, the same dangerous compound present in Agent Orange. Even minute quantities of dioxin proved lethal to animals in tests. Prolonged exposure in humans was linked to cancer and other severe health problems. During manufacturing, a thick, oily sludge rich in dioxin collected at the bottom of the tanks. Initially, the waste was shipped to a large incinerator out of state, but the cost was prohibitive. The company began looking for cheaper disposal methods. That's when a truck driver named Russell Bliss came into the picture. Bliss's regular work involved collecting used motor oil from garages and factories. He loaded it into tankers and hauled it away. He also ran a side business called dust control. Whenever farms, horse arenas, or small towns complained of dusty, unpaved roads, he would spray waste oil across the surface. The oil bound the dirt, greatly reducing airborne dust. People paid him for the service. He got rid of unwanted oil and earned money at the same time. He had no idea that he was about to set in motion one of the worst environmental catastrophes in American history. The first red flag appeared at a horse stable. In 1971, at Shenandoah Stables near Moscow Mills, Bliss sprayed oil in the riding arena. Within days, birds began falling dead from the rafters. Horses lost patches of hair, developed weeping sores, became weak, and many died. The stable owners suspected the sprayed oil. Tests later confirmed extremely high levels of dioxin in the soil. The matter reached the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. They began compiling a list of sites in Missouri where Bliss had sprayed. Progress was slow. Some locations had contaminated soil removed, but many did not. Agencies lacked complete information, and the company provided limited cooperation. Bliss continued his spraying business. Meanwhile, Times Beach residents, fed up with the dust, heard about a cheap way to treat the roads. From 1972 into the mid-1970s, the town council hired him. Records indicate he spread roughly 16,600 gallons of the contaminated oil mixture across more than 23 miles of dirt roads. Picture a modest orange or white tanker truck moving slowly along the streets of Times Beach. Dark oil sprays from a hose at the rear, coating the road surface. The dust settles almost instantly. Some residents are relieved. No more choking clouds. A few notice an odd chemical smell, but most assume it's simply old motor oil. Nobody realized an invisible toxin was now embedded in every street. For several years, life in Times Beach continued as normal. By the late 1970s, the CDC and the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, were starting to map out dioxin contamination across Missouri, on farms, in horse arenas, on private land. In 1982, the Environmental Defense Fund leaked an EPA document that listed 14 confirmed and more than 40 suspected dioxin sites in the state. Times Beach was on the list. When local newspapers published the story, residents learned for the first time that their town was considered contaminated. The reaction was disbelief mixed with anger. They had lived there for decades, and only now were they being told. EPA scientists arrived to investigate. On the 3rd of December 1982, they collected soil samples from roads and yards and sent them for laboratory analysis. Officials said the results would take some time. People were anxious but remained in their homes. 2 days later, on the 5th of December, torrential rain began. The Merrimack River swelled rapidly. It became the most severe flood in the town's history. Water breached the banks and poured into the streets. Ground floors of many houses filled with water. In some places it reached the second floor. Mobile homes were swept away, cars submerged. Residents were evacuated by boat in a matter of hours. The floodwaters weren't merely river water. Years of oil-soaked roads, now laced with dioxin, mixed with the rising water and spread the contamination across the entire town. The toxin was carried into gardens, backyards, and beneath foundations. Times Beach had become one vast contaminated site. As the flood receded, the EPA lab results arrived. Some soil samples showed dioxin concentrations as high as 0.3 parts per million, 300 ppb. The CDC at the time considered levels above 0.001 ppm, 1 ppb, to be of serious concern, meaning the readings here were hundreds of times above the threshold. The CDC's recommendation was unequivocal: do not allow residents to return. The community faced an agonizing choice. Some argued they had lived there for years without noticeable harm. This was an overreaction, and they could rebuild. Others, those whose pets had died, who had watched filthy water flood their homes, or whose children had developed health issues, refused to raise families on poisoned ground. Town meetings became heated debates. A place that had once felt like one big family fractured into opposing sides. The issue quickly escalated to the national level. In January 1983, President Ronald Reagan established a special task force that included the EPA, CDC, FEMA, and the Army Corps of Engineers. In February 1983, the federal and state governments announced they would buy out approximately 800 homes and 30 businesses at a cost of roughly $36.37 million. The plan was straightforward: compensate residents so they could relocate and start again elsewhere. Government assessors visited each property, evaluated size and condition, and applied a formula to determine offers. Owners of sturdier brick houses often felt the valuations were far too low. Some accepted the money. Flood damage was already extensive, the dioxin story had made national headlines, and financial pressures from loans and employment were mounting. Others challenged the offers in court. In the end, courts condemned the properties and awarded even less compensation, with no additional relocation assistance. Those who fought hardest often ended up worse off financially. When families relocated, they didn't only lose their homes, they encountered stigma. In new schools, some teachers seated children from Times Beach apart, worried about contamination. Dry cleaners sometimes refused their laundry. Neighbors murmured about those people from the toxic town. By 1985, nearly everyone had left. The Missouri governor signed an order formally dissolving Times Beach as a legal entity. The last house stood empty. The streets held nothing but broken glass, overgrown weeds, and silence. A large-scale cleanup followed. The decision was made to excavate the contaminated soil and incinerate it at extremely high temperatures to destroy the dioxin. Between 1996 and 1997, around 265,000 tons of polluted soil from more than 20 sites across Missouri were transported to the location and burned. Some residents protested, concerned that any mishap could release toxins into the air. Officials maintained that the intense heat would fully break down the dioxin. Subsequent testing confirmed the area was safe. In 1999, Route 66 State Park opened on the site. Today it features walking trails, playgrounds, picnic areas, and wildlife. A small fenced mound and a modest visitor center exhibit are the only reminders that an entire town once stood here. Each year, on the last Saturday in September, former residents return. They stand on the grass and trace invisible outlines in the air. Our house was here, the school over there. Their children listen to the stories. The actual streets and foundations were long ago removed by bulldozers. That's the story of a town the United States caused to disappear almost overnight. Had you ever heard of Times Beach before?